There is something unsettling about these old photographs. At first glance, they look like curiosities from another world. Strange costumes, theatrical poses, enormous crowds, and people whose bodies look different from what society considered normal. But if you look at the faces instead of the bodies, something changes. You begin to realize that these were not photographs of monsters. They were photographs of people. People who had families, ambitions, fears, friendships, rivalries, bills to pay, and sometimes extraordinary careers. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, traveling circuses and so-called freak shows became a major form of entertainment in Europe and North America. Performers with unusual physical characteristics could be presented to audiences as something extraordinary. The language used at the time was often cruel by modern standards, and many of the people displayed in these shows were advertised with sensational names designed to shock and attract customers. Today, the idea of putting a person's body on display for entertainment is deeply uncomfortable. Yet the history is more complicated than the photographs might suggest. For some performers, these shows represented exploitation. For others, they represented one of the few opportunities available to earn an independent living, and for a surprisingly small number, they became extremely successful. Imagine arriving at a 19th century fair. The streets are crowded with people. Vendors shout to attract customers. Music comes from somewhere behind a row of brightly painted tents. Posters cover wooden walls, promising audiences something they have never seen before. One poster might advertise an acrobat, another might promise a magician, and another might announce a person described as the smallest man alive, the tallest woman in the world, or some other extraordinary human attraction. The audience enters expecting a spectacle, but behind the poster is a human being waiting for the curtain to rise. One of the most famous figures of this era was Charles Stratton, better known to millions as General Tom Thumb. Born in Connecticut in 1838, Stratton was unusually small because of a form of dwarfism. When he was still a child, he was introduced to the legendary showman P.T. Barnum. Barnum understood something that would transform American entertainment. People would pay to see something they believed they could never encounter in ordinary life. Stratton was trained to perform, sing, dance, and play characters. Barnum carefully constructed a stage persona around him, and the young performer became enormously popular. But there was an important difference between simply being exhibited and becoming a professional entertainer. Tom Thumb performed. He had a carefully developed stage personality, appeared in elaborate costumes, and participated in theatrical productions. His fame spread far beyond America. He even traveled to Europe and performed before Queen Victoria. His success became so enormous that he eventually became wealthy. And that is where the story becomes complicated. Was Tom Thumb exploited? In many ways, yes. His unusual body was turned into a commercial attraction. But was he simply a powerless victim? The historical record suggests something more complicated. He became a celebrity, accumulated wealth, and eventually had a level of independence that most people with disabilities in the 19th century could scarcely imagine. His story demonstrates one of the central contradictions of the freak show era. The same industry that turned physical difference into entertainment could sometimes provide opportunities that mainstream society refused to provide. And Tom Thumb was only the beginning, because as the popularity of sideshows grew, performers with radically different appearances began entering the industry. Some were born with unusual physical characteristics. Others had disabilities. Some had conditions that would today be diagnosed and medically understood. And some were deliberately presented through completely fictional stories. The audience often had no way of knowing where reality ended and theatrical exaggeration began. That distinction mattered enormously, because the people inside these tents were not simply freaks. They were workers participating in an entertainment industry. Some negotiated contracts, some became managers, some traveled internationally, some married other performers, some supported entire families with the money they earned, and some became famous enough that their photographs were sold around the world. But not everyone had the same level of control. Many performers were children when they entered the industry. Some were recruited because poverty left them with few alternatives. Others were pressured by managers or family members. And some were displayed under sensational stories that reduced their entire identity to a single physical characteristic. So when we look at these photographs today, we have to ask a different question. Not simply, what was unusual about this person, but who was this person when the camera stopped recording? That question leads us to some of the most fascinating stories hidden inside these photographs. Because behind the costumes, advertisements, and stage names were real lives, and some of those lives were far more extraordinary than the posters ever revealed. Perhaps the most famous symbol of the 19th century freak show era was P.T. Barnum. Barnum understood publicity almost as well as anyone who ever lived. He knew that a photograph could become an advertisement, a strange story could become a newspaper headline, and a mysterious performer could become a celebrity. His American Museum in New York became famous for displaying everything from natural history curiosities to performers and people with unusual physical characteristics. But Barnum's greatest talent was not simply finding unusual people. It was creating stories around them. A person could be given an exotic title, a dramatic biography, an elaborate costume, and a carefully designed performance. The audience was not merely paying to see a person. They were paying to enter a story. One of Barnum's most successful performers was General Tom Thumb. But another remarkable story belonged to Chang and Eng Bunker, the famous conjoined twins who were born in Siam in 1811. They later became known throughout the Western world as the Siamese twins. The term itself eventually became associated with conjoined twins in general, although today it is considered outdated. Chang and Eng were brought to the United States as young men and exhibited internationally. But they did something extraordinary. They eventually separated themselves from the control of their early promoters and established their own careers. They toured extensively, negotiated performances, and accumulated substantial wealth. Later, they settled in North Carolina, married sisters Adelaide and Sarah Yates, and raised large families. Their lives were far more complicated than the sensational posters suggested. They were businessmen, they were husbands, they were fathers, and they were celebrities living under an enormous amount of public attention. Their story also reveals something important about the economics of the sideshow. A performer who became popular could sometimes earn considerably more money than someone working an ordinary job. This was especially important in a period when discrimination could make conventional employment extremely difficult. A person with a visible disability might be rejected from many workplaces. But the circus could say, "We don't care that you look different. Your difference is exactly what we are selling." That statement contains both opportunity and exploitation. The performer could earn money precisely because the public considered them unusual. But the same system encouraged audiences to think of human beings as spectacles. One of the most famous female performers was Annie Jones, known professionally as the Bearded Girl. Jones was born in Virginia in 1865 with a condition that caused excessive facial hair. She was still a child when P.T. Barnum exhibited her. Photographs of Jones were distributed widely, and she became a recognizable figure. But unlike the cruel caricatures used in some advertisements, Jones was a professional performer who developed her own career. She traveled, appeared on stage, and earned money from her performances. Her photographs survive today, and they reveal something that the sensational advertisements often concealed. She looks composed, confident, almost defiant. She is not posing like a monster, she is posing like a professional. Another famous performer was Lionel, whose real name was Stefan Bobrowski. Born in Poland in 1890, Bobrowski had hypertrichosis, a rare condition resulting in unusually heavy hair growth over much of the body. As a child, he was brought into the entertainment world and eventually became known as the Lionel, the Lion-Faced Man. His appearance was sensationalized by promoters, but people who knew him described a very different personality. Bobrowski was reportedly intelligent, well-spoken, and interested in becoming a dentist. That contrast is one of the most revealing aspects of freak show history. The poster said, "Look at the strange creature." The person underneath the costume could be thinking, "Look at me, I am a human being." The same pattern appeared again and again. Performers were given theatrical names because theatrical names sold tickets. A person could become the human skeleton, the bearded lady, the lion-faced man, or another dramatic title. The name became a brand, and the photograph became the advertisement. But some performers understood the business better than the people who advertised them. They learned how to negotiate. They learned how to perform. They learned how to control their public image. And in some cases, they became wealthy. This was particularly true in the golden age of the traveling sideshow, when thousands of people could gather at fairs and circuses. The crowds wanted something extraordinary. The performers needed an income, and the entertainment industry discovered that those two desires could fit together, although not always fairly. But there was another group whose stories were even more complicated. Children who were born with unusual characteristics could become attractions before they were old enough to understand what was happening. And once a child became famous, escaping the world that had created the fame could be almost impossible. That is where the history becomes darker. One of the most uncomfortable things about studying old circus photographs is realizing how young some of the performers were. Today, we understand that children with disabilities require protection, education, and opportunities that do not depend on public fascination with their bodies. But the 19th century had very different standards. There were few legal protections. Medical knowledge was limited. Disability was heavily stigmatized, and poverty could force families to make decisions that would be almost unimaginable today. For some children, joining a traveling show meant escaping poverty. For others, it meant losing control over their own childhood. A famous example is Ella Harper, who became known as the Camel Girl. Harper was born in Tennessee in 1870 with a rare orthopedic condition that caused her knees to bend backward. She could walk in a distinctive posture, and promoters turned that characteristic into a stage identity. In 1886, when she was around 16, she appeared with W.H. Harris's nickel-plate circus. Her publicity card described her condition in sensational language. But Harper's story took an unexpected turn. She did not spend her entire life performing. Eventually, she left the entertainment business. She married and lived a much quieter life. That decision is important because it reminds us that not every performer wanted fame forever. For some, the circus was a career. For others, it was simply a chapter of their life. And some people entered the sideshow because there were very few alternatives. The same period also produced performers whose stories became legends almost completely detached from reality. Consider Schlitzie, one of the most famous sideshow performers of the 20th century. Schlitzie was born with microcephaly and appeared in traveling shows under sensational stage identities. He later became widely known after appearing in the 1932 film Freaks. The film itself is historically important because many of its performers were actual sideshow artists. It also reveals something uncomfortable. The film attempted to challenge the audience's assumptions about who should be considered a freak. Yet at the same time, it placed real disabled performers inside a sensational entertainment spectacle. The boundary between exploitation and representation was incredibly thin, and it still is. Another famous figure was Myrtle Corbin, born in 1868 in Tennessee. She had a rare congenital condition that resulted in a duplicated lower body structure. She was exhibited as the four-legged girl. Her photographs were distributed widely, but behind the stage name was a woman who eventually married, had children, and lived a private life. Her existence was extraordinary from a medical perspective. Her life was ordinary in many other ways. That distinction is essential. The performers were not their conditions. They were people who happened to live with them. Some married, some had children, some ran businesses, some became wealthy, some disappeared into obscurity, and some died young. The photographs rarely tell us which story we are looking at. That is why these images can be so misleading. A photograph freezes one moment. The advertisement tells us what the promoter wanted us to believe, but neither tells us what happened when the performer returned home at night. What did they eat? Who did they love? Were they happy? Did they resent the industry? Did they consider themselves successful? Did they have another dream? Historical documents sometimes answer those questions, and when they do, the result is often surprising. Some performers were proud of their careers. They knew that their appearance gave them a way to earn money that mainstream society denied them. Others were openly critical of the way they were advertised. Still others seem to have accepted the theatrical nature of the business and treated it as simply another profession. There was no single experience. That is perhaps the greatest mistake we can make when looking at the history of freak shows. We imagine one story. There were thousands, and the industry itself was changing. By the early 20th century, attitudes toward disability, medicine, and entertainment began to shift. Modern medicine was developing rapidly. Photography became increasingly common. Film created new forms of spectacle. Radio and mass newspapers transformed celebrity culture, and public attitudes toward displaying people with disabilities began to change. The old sideshow model gradually became less acceptable, but it did not disappear overnight. For decades, traveling fairs and circuses continued to feature human attractions. And even after the traditional freak show declined, the idea survived in movies, television, and popular culture. The names changed, the technology changed, but the fascination with people who appeared different remained. That raises a difficult question. Did society really become less fascinated by physical difference? Or did it simply learn to look at it in a different way?